David Walker, you've been watching this process for a long time. How would you describe fiscal conditions in the country right now?
They're poor and they're deteriorating, and we really have two problems. One that the American people have heard a lot about, the so-called fiscal cliff, which is supposed to happen at the end of this year, and we need to avoid the fiscal cliff. But we need to recognize that that's actually the symptom. It's not the disease. The disease are the large and growing structural deficits that lie ahead, which represent a fiscal abyss. So we have to avoid the fiscal cliff and build a bridge to address the fiscal abyss.
What is your level of confidence that, first things first, the fiscal cliff can be avoided?
I'm cautiously optimistic. The first week we heard some good language, from both sides. Last week was rather disappointing, but I think that both sides really do want to avoid it. And what we need to do is to recognize you can't do a so-called grand bargain in a lame duck session. But we ought to do something to demonstrate that we're serious about dealing with these structural problems. And so I think they need to separate the wheat from the chaff between what should be extended, what shouldn't. The real sticking point is going to be is what happens with regard to taxes on the wealthy. There are ways to increase the effective tax rate of the wealthy without increasing marginal tax rates. And hopefully they'll come to an agreement on that pending more comprehensive tax reform.
Phone numbers on the bottom of the screen for David Walker, the former U.S. Comptroller General. We're talking here about the fiscal cliff and the national debt. We have separate phone lines for Democrats and Republicans and independents. Look forward to hearing from all of you. We'll also get some tweets out there as well for David Walker, who, again, is founder and CEO of the Comeback America Initiative. Remind us what that organization is all about.
It's a 501c3 nonprofit that focuses on citizen education and engagement with regard to federal, state, and local fiscal challenges, and tries to come up with nonpartisan solutions that ought to be able to gain bipartisan support to put our finances in order.
So there's short term, there's long term. We've been talking about the deadline coming at the end of December. What do you realistically see as a short term solution to avoiding that cliff?
Well, for example, there are certain things that are scheduled to expire that should be allowed to expire. The 2% payroll tax deduction. That was intended to be a temporary stimulus. It also set a very bad precedent for general revenue funding of Social Security. That's over $100 billion. 99 weeks is enough for unemployment benefits. We've extended it several times, and that was appropriate, but that's enough. We need to do something on the alternative minimum tax to deal with the inflation aspect. We need to avoid a 30% cut in physician payments. There should be some reduction in defense and other spending, but less than what's scheduled for the sequester. And then the balance of the big items can be deferred for 9 months to a year to give time for the Congress to engage the American people and do the work inside the so-called Beltway to get a grand bargain. Social insurance reforms, comprehensive tax reform, and appropriate defense and other spending reductions.
Remind us, in your view, what are the dangers of not acting thoroughly on all these items you're bringing up?
Well, the big danger of not acting on the fiscal cliff is that consensus opinion is if we cut spending that dramatically, if we end up increasing taxes that dramatically, that it will put us back into recession, it will exacerbate our unemployment and underemployment problems, and nobody wants that. Now, there are things that can be done to kind of smooth it a little bit so it's not quite as sudden. Probably not quite as sudden. I'm Southern, sorry about that. Not quite as sudden, but it's real. And the other thing that people forget about is that if you want to end up unscrambling the egg, if you go over the cliff and you want to end up doing something to unscramble it, then you better have 60 votes in the Senate, or either you better have a package that will end up reducing the deficit, because that's the only way that you can use this procedure called budget reconciliation. You've got to reduce the deficit. But if you're trying to reverse tax increases or you're trying to reverse spending cuts, those things increase the deficit.
Before we get to calls, back to your use of the word abyss, here's a headline that was out there recently. Former U.S. Comptroller says U.S. faces fiscal abyss. Take us deeper into that point that you're making.
We really have a short-term challenge, which is the fiscal cliff. The tax cuts, the schedule, the tax increases that are scheduled, the expiration of the tax cuts, and then the scheduled sequestration and other spending cuts. That's the short-term issue. The structural is the known demographic trends. 10,000 people a day are retiring and will for the next 17 years. Healthcare costs are still growing much faster than inflation and the economy. Our tax system is outdated and needs to be restructured. Those create large and growing deficits into the future. And it's not the long term anymore. It's the longer term. It's here. We see it. These are going to be with us for a long time, and we need to recognize that reality and act sooner rather than later.
Our first call for David Walker comes from Philadelphia. It's Frank on the Republican line. Good morning, Frank.
Good morning. This question is to